Hello, and welcome to the May edition of Mentor Live. This broadcast is presented by the National Association of Flight Instructors, and we're delighted to have all of you with us tonight. We do have a couple of housekeeping slides to go over just before we get started for our program. If you look at the broadcast page, you'll see a small icon that will let you control the resolution if you're having trouble with different internet speeds. So feel free to adjust that as you need to. Also, we are broadcasting at the same time on the Mentor Live page and also on NAFI Facebook page. So we would encourage you to post your comments and questions on either site. And if we have time during the broadcast to answer some of them, we will be glad to. Some other housekeeping things concern the Wings program, and perhaps we could hear about that, Susan.
Hi, yes, this program is available for Wings credit. There's a short quiz that you will take after you've been through this broadcast, and you can earn Wings credit by going to the link shown here, clicking on that, and it'll take you to the page where you can go and take care of the formalities and get your Wings credit. Another opportunity that you have, and we really want you to do the course evaluation because it's always good to find a way to make things better. And if you do the course evaluation, you'll notice here that there are NAFI 50th anniversary shirts that are available, and completing the course evaluation will enter you into, give you an opportunity to win one of those. So that's an extra incentive to do the course evaluation. Hope you'll do both of those things.
So tonight's program is Challenge and Response, Practical Flight Deck Insights for General Aviation. It's an exciting topic that we're both looking forward to discussing and sharing with you. And I'm Paul Preidecker. I'll be challenged, I believe, by my host, Susan Parson. Susan, please introduce yourself.
I'm Susan Parson. I'm the editor of FAA Safety Briefing magazine, work on the ACS project. And yes, I'm here tonight to challenge Paul in a couple of ways, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I will.
Let's get started.
Absolutely. So let's start with this one. Whose job is harder? I've had a couple of my airline pilot friends tell me that flying for the airlines is the easiest job they've ever had because so many things are done for them. And I have long told my airline pilot friends that you guys manage systems while the rest of us actually fly airplanes. So when I think about some of the things that I have done, single pilot, single engine, IFR, and all the planning and things that it takes, I've gone across the country literally in a GA airplane with all the arrangements that are involved in that on before and after the flight. So it seems to me that the job that we general aviation pilots have is a lot harder than what airline pilots have. So that's my challenge to you. But I want to know, I know that you've thought a lot about this because you inhabit both worlds. Am I right?
So you are right. We can just start out with that. I've had the opportunity to move between Part 121 flying and general aviation flying, as I still have a passion and an interest in both. On occasion, I've been able to have a general aviation flight in the morning, and in the afternoon, get on the airline and do my airline job. And it gives me a really nice comparison of both worlds. So I think the best way to start this is by saying, yes, I agree. We've created a small table on our next slide just to bring some of these items into view and to show some of the comparisons between general aviation and Part 121. We're not going to look at all of these, but I'd like to cover some of them. I've certainly had some challenging flights under Part 121, but I would absolutely say that general aviation in many respects is more difficult and more challenging. If we just start with a few of the ones that are on this table, many general aviation operations are single pilot. And of course, in a 135 or 121 operation, there is a crew. And I'm not saying that the crew solves everything, because there are challenges in working with a crew, but that's something that in our training programs we train. But as a single pilot, it does mean that you're going to be responsible for absolutely everything. Also in general aviation, the airports you fly to might be not familiar. Maybe it's the first time you've gone to them. One of the things under Part 121, we go to many of the same airports in a routine basis, and we often are flying the same approaches to those airports, sometimes several times a day. So just the familiarity with our operation helps build our skills, and it makes it look easy, even though there are some challenges in that. Probably the biggest thing is that as a general aviation pilot, the planning is completely up to you. In a Part 121 world, we have dispatchers that plan our fuel. They send us the weather, they send us the flight release, they send us the flight plan, they send us the page with the NOTAMs on it. It's all done for us. Of course, that doesn't relieve us of our responsibility to review things, but in a general aviation flight, you need to do it all yourself. So there are many great apps out there for iPads and other applications where you have some flight planning tools, but the burden does fall on a general aviation pilot to accomplish all this. And even something as simple as a hotel. In the 121 environment, we don't call the hotel, we don't call a van, we just get off the airplane, walk out to the curb, and somebody magically appears to take us to the hotel. And of course, in the GA world, you have to manage that yourselves, find a crew car, rental car, make all your arrangements. The part about communications, I've often heard people say, well, the airline pilot sounds so professional on the radio. Well, keep in mind that an airline pilot is not, the person who's flying is not actually on the radio. Our responsibilities are divided into pilot flying and pilot not flying, or pilot monitoring, and that person is the one on the radio. The person who's actually manipulating the controls is concentrating on flying. In GA, of course, you need to manage the flight, manage the radios, multitask, and keep everything together. Another difference, our flight decks are predictable and they're all laid out the same. So at our airline, we have about 65 airplanes. I can tell you what the panel looks like on every one of them. But as a renter, especially in general aviation, you might rent aircraft that are slightly different in configuration. So that also might give you some challenges in terms of how to run some of the automation and some of the GPSs that are installed. Certainly, most general aviation aircraft are performance limited. So weather and weather planning becomes an issue. We have the opportunity to either go around or go above most of the weather. So that makes it quite easy for us. Also, although Part 121 operations do operate into non-towered airports, it's not our normal. Mostly we're operating into towered airports where we just do what they say. In general aviation, you have to manage the entry into the traffic pattern and manage all of that yourself without the help of air traffic control. Maybe the last thing on this slide, which is, I think, something that's the most important, and it will become the subject of our discussion tonight, we live by standardization and standard operating procedures. And that's something that I'm suggesting that we bring more into general aviation to make it easier and also safe. So that's sort of a wrap up of kind of characterizing both worlds. Both have their challenges, but Susan, I would say that GA is a bit more difficult.
I was going to say, as we move on to the next slide, I was going to say you've certainly made my case. You
well,
responded.
I thought it was best to do so.
You've responded to that challenge quite well. So here's the next challenge, and I think you've already mentioned a little bit of it. If we can move on to the next slide, you'll see, the tips, help, support, and guidance. That's what we're here for tonight, because you have lived in both worlds. You do actively live in both worlds. I would like to talk tonight about what are the parts and practices of airline flying that can be easily adapted, scaled to work for GA, and to make things easier for us, but without some of the rigidity that frankly is very unappealing in general aviation. We like the freedom, we like the flexibility. I know you do too. So how do you thread the needle? That's what we want to talk about tonight.
So our next visual is kind of sums it all up into one phrase. And the theme that will come through tonight is standard operating procedures that we use in a Part 121 operation to do everything the same way. It's standard, it adds to safety. There are some standard operating procedures that can be built into a general aviation environment, and we'll give you a few tips as we go through this about how to do that. This is a concept that appeared in some articles from AOPA and also EAA, and we'll reference those articles later in the broadcast. But remember that in general aviation, you are the captain, you're the dispatcher, you're the maintenance controller, you're the logistics coordinator for everything else about it. And general aviation pilots can create their own standard operating procedures based on individual requirements. It basically means doing the same thing, the same time to build confidence and skill, and it will help you deal with the unexpected. So we have a plan here on this visual about standard operating procedures, and it's on purpose. It's in a circle, and the circle is really, I would say, a continuum of how this should work. The 5 components of standard operating procedures that we'll go through in a little bit more detail are plan, brief, do, review, and renew. And the reason we have it in a continuum is that this has to be a continuous process. Everything we do, every flight, we need to build in the standard operating procedures, brief what we're going to be doing, do what the plan is, review is sort of a cross-check, and then renewing is really about training. So that's our concept, Susan.
Well, it's a good concept, and it's the way that you've talked about it is a continuum. It applies to all phases of flight, and it is continuous. I always talk about it's the same way when you think about cross-check, interpret, and control, which are the instrument skills. You don't just do that once. You're constantly doing cross-check, interpret, and control, and then checking yourself again and starting all over again. So just like this, it is continuous. So let's go.
Okay. So the first part of this is we want to plan everything. And this is, as we said, a know before you go. We've adopted the concept of PAVE, and many general aviation pilots are familiar with PAVE. Let's go through some of those elements on the next visual. We have pilot, and it's the pilot part of this is what I would call is the personal minimums checklist. The pilot issues that you need to build into this include, legal requirements. Are we legal to fly? Are we current to fly? Currency, of course, doesn't mean proficiency, but we also want to make sure that we are proficient. Certainly, there are times when we could say that we're legally qualified and current, but maybe we're a bit rusty. In my own general aviation world, I keep an electronic logbook, which helps keep track of currency. I keep up with, my landings. I keep up with my approaches just so that I have a ready reference to it. In the airline world, in Part 121, our crew scheduling department keeps all track of that for us. So they know about our duty time, they know about our currency, they know about our legality. And the other part in the 121 world is we actually have to sign a release, either electronically or in paper, that says we're fit for duty. Under general aviation, it's up to you to determine that. So Susan, I think you might have another variation of this that you wanted to bring up. And
yeah,
we need to move on to the next visual, I believe.
Yeah, it is on the next visual. What is on what general aviation pilots are familiar with is the I'm safe checklist as part of your fitness to fly, that I'm free of illness, medication, stress, alcohol, of course, fatigue, and then the E can be eating or emotion. And both of those things are really important. But when you talk about fitness to fly, I mean, you all have pretty strict regulations about when you can flying fatigued and signing papers and things like that. We don't do that in general aviation, but we could and we should in terms of one of the things that I advocate is personal minimums, written personal minimums that can be part of making sure it really should be part of your standard operating procedure to check your personal minimums for yourself as well as for everything else that we're going to be talking about here.
And one of the points that we're sort of talking about this planning, when we think about standard operating procedures, most people equate that to the actual flight. And what I'm suggesting is it's not just the flight, but it's standard operating procedures about everything we do for the planning up to the flight. So as we discussed, checking our own qualifications, making sure that we do that in a methodical manner. It's just a way of keeping us safe.
Well, and I think you also want to, one of the points on here that is implied in these words, qualified, current, and proficient. So you have to check your physical and mental health, but you also, one of the things that you need to check is your currency. To be legal to me means that you're qualified for what operation you're going to do, and also means that you're legally current. But I think we all know that those two, you can be those two things and still not be proficient if you haven't practiced. And it's important to have all of those things, because I always make the point that you can, your medical certificate is good, as long as you meet the criteria for it. And if you're really sick someday, that's not a good thing to go do. Sure. And if you don't feel proficient in the operation you're going to go do, it should be part of your standard operating procedure to just stay on the ground.
That's right. Let's move on to the next element of PAVE, which is about the airplane. Just like in general aviation, you have your pilot operating handbook. In the 121 world, we also have our handbooks. We call it a flight crew manual, pilot operating handbook, airplane flight manual. You absolutely have to know your equipment. And of course, in a 121 environment, we're trained to know the equipment from a system standpoint, but also about the operational procedures. We need to make sure in general aviation that we apply those same concepts about knowing the airplane, especially if you're a renter and you're renting different aircraft. We need to be familiar with performance, weight and balance, and also just the legalities of the aircraft itself. So, Susan, I know that you have an opportunity to fly different general aviation airplanes. How do you keep track of that yourself?
I do. Well, first of all, I do pay attention to the airplane flying handbook. And if there's a plane I haven't flown in a while, I'll try to do something like look at the panel. I actually have pictures of airplane panels that I can look at, including my own, so that sometimes I can remind myself of where things are. That's especially true if I'm flying. Some of the Civil Air Patrol aircraft are configured differently, and it's really important to know where to reach for what particular thing that you're looking for, and which GPS does it have, and which autopilot does it have, and that sort of thing. One of the things that I think is really important to include in an SOP is some rules for how you're going to deal with automation if you're not familiar with it, when you're going to use the autopilot, when you're going to use the flight director, how you're going to know which thing you're doing. But it's really important to refresh your knowledge if you have an airplane you don't fly regularly, of what its performance characteristics and limitations are, and where all of the switches and buttons are, and so that you're not surprised. And if you're flying with other people who can be a distraction, if you're flying in instrument conditions, which can also be a distraction, it's even more important to include kind of a basic review of airplane performance, equipment, and so on before you start. Another thing you can do, people talk about chair flying.
Sure.
And I try to do that, but another thing that sometimes I've done in airplanes, if it's something that I haven't flown in a while, don't be in a hurry. Get in, sit down, look at everything on the panel before you go, and that can be part of your standard operating procedure for the airplane as well.
I actually do the same thing. My main job at my airline is a flight instructing, and so a lot of my time is spent in simulators. And I do stay current and hopefully proficient when I'm flying. But if I haven't flown in a while, what I find myself doing is maybe getting to the aircraft instead of 45 minutes early, which is our normal check-in time. I might get there an hour early, just to sit and review and make sure that I'm familiar with all of the procedures, and it just helps reset my clock a little bit. So the same thing that you do in general aviation is actually what I do in a 121 environment. So speaking of environment, that's the next element of our PAVE model. There are many challenges here, and there's no difference really between operating under 121 or 135 or GA. These are things that are common to all of us. We have to be familiar with the airport that we're going to, of course. In our world, we routinely fly into large congested airports. In our operation, O'Hare is one of the most popular ones. But routine is the key. We routinely go in. So through that routine, we become quite familiar with the procedures. I can tell you, however, that at an airport like O'Hare, they don't always get the memo about what we're thinking. We might have an idea about what runway we anticipate landing on, but they may have some other idea. So this just becomes part of our routine that, yes, we're familiar with the airport, but at a given time and space, air traffic control may have a different plan for us. So we have to be ready for that. In general aviation, we study airport diagrams for departure, destination. I look especially for hotspots, just like I would in a 121 environment, to make sure that I'm familiar as I'm taxiing around by myself in a general aviation airplane, and I'm familiar with some of the threats, that can come from taxiing. Airspace is certainly more of a challenge in general aviation because in 121 we file IFR. IFR takes care of all of our problems. We're clear through whatever airspace there is. We don't even think about it. But Susan, I know that where you live and fly, you're in the special flight rules area. So tell me how you become familiar with that. I know you had quite a bit to do with the development of them, but how do you manage them?
Only the course. I didn't develop the area, but so don't send me hate mail for that one. I did work on the course for it. Yeah, I think what you're saying here is that part of your planning and part of your, not just planning, because we have airports, airspace, and weather are part of all phases of flight, really, that it's just very important as part of your standard operating procedure to know before you go. Know what the airspace is and know what the rules for it are, especially if you're going to be VFR. Know what the characteristics of the departure and destination airports are. And if you're going to an airport that's not familiar to you, make sure that in these days with apps, you can take your finger and put a marker on, and you can map out the taxi route or whatever. I've seen people put X's on closed spaces.
Sure.
But part of your standard operating procedure, if you know before you go or before you get to where you're planning to operate, that's going to be very helpful. The other thing that I use with weather, when I was done with my instrument training, I realized how much I didn't know. And I developed a framework that's been very helpful to me, and I've used it a lot in teaching, that I think of the pilot and the airplane that we've already talked about, their team. And I have a phrase I like, which is you may be super pilot, but if you're flying a super cub, you've got limitations that are not your fault, they're the airplane's fault, if you want to put it that way.
Well,
so,
I like that. That's a very nice way of putting it. On the weather, one of the things about weather, of course, we have to be familiar with the weather at our departure and destination and en route. But the other part of standard operating procedures is to know and live by your personal minimums.
Yep, absolutely.
For instrument pilots that are first starting out, you of course are going to set your personal minimums to be a little bit higher. As you get a little bit more proficient, you might have a reason to lower them, but you need to live by the limitations that you've set for yourself as part of your standard operating procedures. And the other thing that is sometimes missed in the overall planning is NOTAMs. And to me, it's really important that we emphasize taking the time to go through the NOTAMs for the flight. I realize that for most people, NOTAMs are the FAA equivalent of an IQ test, because trying to decode everything and make sense out of it is a challenge, even for us in the 121 world. But it has to be done, because you might have a flight between two airports that maybe only are 30, 40 miles away, and it's a bright, clear, beautiful day. That doesn't relieve you of the responsibility to continue building in note and review as part of your procedures.
Yeah, there are a couple of other points I want to make about the weather. We talked about the limitations you have depending on what you're flying. But you know, one of the things, Paul, when you talk about personal minimums as part of your SOP, if I'm not mistaken, airlines have limitations for new captains. There are certain, and because if you think that limitations are not something that airlines do, I think you live and breathe by that sort of thing.
We live and breathe by limitations for everything from crosswinds to certainly weather minimums. In the 121 rules, we're not even authorized to start an approach if the weather is below minimums. There is no such thing as a 0-0 takeoff in the 121 world. And yes, you're right. New captains have higher operating minimums, as well as new first officers. With time, of course, those minimums are reduced, but we do live by limitations that are checked frequently during training and checking events.
Yeah, and GA pilots, we have a lot of flexibility, but we really, you know, one of the things that I do with personal minimums, both the ones I have and the ones that I try to teach people to develop, you know, follow those, because you can test them under controlled conditions. The other thing I wanted to say before we go on to this slide, there's a phrase that a friend taught me years ago, having to do with planning for dealing with various parts of pilot, airplane, environment, everything we've talked about so far. The way she put it is, if you have to use the word probably in association with anything you're going to do, you had definitely better think about it again. So that rule of probably is very important. And I think that also goes to, that kind of helps lead into our next topic, which is the big one. It's external pressures. So
there's no question that every pilot needs to manage external pressures. In the 121 environment, I would say that the external pressures come directly from our schedules. We were able to bid our schedules, but if we have a departure at 6:55 in the morning, there's no better way to run an airline than to run it on time. We need to be ready to go by 6:55 and push back. So there are pressures that are coming directly from us, or directly to us from the airline. There's also operational pressures that come from ourselves. For example, on the last day of a 4-day trip, if your trip ends at an airport that you don't live at, which is actually quite common in the airline world, you need to arrange a flight to get home. Well, you can't let the feeling of, I want to make my commute, override your decisions about how you're operating a flight when it comes to maybe taking extra time for a go around or whatever the circumstance may be. In the general aviation world, we often hear about get there-itis. It's not much different than the 121 world, but we learn to manage that pressure as a threat and help mitigate it. And I see that we do actually have a question from a viewer. When briefing an expected approach, how frequently is there a runway change? The answer to that kind of varies on the airport. I would tell you that at an airport like Chicago, it's quite often, actually. I would say maybe in excess of 50% of the time, based on their particular situation at the point. We may be thinking we're going to get to a center, but in fact, it's going to be 27 left. And of course, they don't tell you that until you're getting pretty close. But the other thing is, keep in mind in general aviation, you have a choice and you can speak up. A controller might offer you up a runway that maybe is pushing the limits of how you want to manage that flight from a crosswind standpoint. If I don't necessarily like what a controller is serving up, I'll put a request in for something else. So you do have that flexibility. I think it's one of those things that we just have to manage. It's a bit of, it puts some time pressure on us, but if you anticipate it and you expect that it could occur, then you're better able to manage it. So thank you for that question. And Susan, go on about the GA side of external pressures, please.
Well, to me, the most important thing about external pressures, some of the ones that you face in the airline world are more visible and more common. Some of I think there's perhaps a lot more variety in external pressures in GA. And I had an experience a few years ago that really made me understand a critical thing, that sometimes we feel pressure to continue and to keep going and to get where we're going, the so-called get home-itis, but we really don't know exactly what's pushing us in that direction. And if you stop and identify what it is that's making you think that you need to keep going, that will help you do the right thing. And my story was years ago, I was headed toward Asheville, North Carolina, and my mother was waiting to pick me up. I was with another pilot, and we were going along, and the terrain was rising and the ceiling was lowering. And we both kept going. We both had reasons we wanted to be in Asheville, but I was conscious of the fact that this was not a good thing. But I couldn't figure out at first why I was pressing forward. And then I thought, I'm worried about my mother worrying. And I mentally put my mother in a box. I've told her this story, she knows it. I said, Mom, you're going to have to be in a box, and I'm sorry, you're just going to have to worry for a little while. We have to do something different. So I said to my fellow pilot, I said, you know what, I don't like this. And he was turning the airplane before I'd finished the sentence. So we went to another airport, we landed, I called her, and she said she was so glad we had made the right decision. But it was really funny that it took me, I had to make an effort to figure out what it was that was pushing me. So part of my advice is, if something's bugging you, don't keep going, figure out what it is before you go on.
And do something about it, of course.
Absolutely.
I mean, in my previous flying life, I flew out of a small airport near my home in Madison, and many of the flights were at night because I was flying for the local hospital's organ transplant team. So I would sometimes leave an untowered, uncontrolled airport, late at night, to return sometime later that night. But if the weather had been bad or it had been snowing, I had no idea what the runway situation was. Everybody's car was there. There was, this idea that, well, we'll try this, but it's such a simple thing to say, no, we'll just divert and arrange ground transportation, once we get on the ground, and be safe about it. But we all have to fight those pressures. And again, part of your standard operating procedures is to recognize that we all have external pressures. We just have to recognize them and mitigate them.
Exactly. Well, I think we've covered all the major elements of planning. So now let's do. So briefings.
Briefings to me are an essential part of standard operating procedures. In a 121 or a crew environment, briefings are rather obvious and they're rather easy. The flying pilot will brief to the non-flying pilot how we're going to manage this flight. The very purpose of the briefing, though, is to create what I would call a shared mental model of how we're going to operate this flight. There is nothing to stop a single pilot from doing the same thing. The briefing can just simply start with a review of the airport diagrams, a review of the weather, and actually brief to yourself, out loud if you want. I mean, who's going to listen? It can be a virtual brief, but briefing the way that you intend to fly this flight, to me, is a key element to manage safety and to mitigate the risks. And Susan, I know that you're a fan of this checklist, which is on the slide, called safety briefing. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'll come back to that in a second, but on the self-briefing, let me just say, if I'm by myself, and I can be a chatty soul, yeah, I knew you knew that. So I think of briefing aloud as it's the way to help your brain and your body connect. And I think of it as, even if I'm just by myself, if I have me, myself, and I all on the same page, that's a good thing. The second thing, you've got crew briefing there. If you are flying with another pilot, it is extremely important in GA, where we don't have the sort of standardization that the airlines have, and all crews know how the pilot flying and the pilot not flying are going to act. It is so important in general aviation to do a briefing and make sure everybody knows who's going to do what are the roles and responsibilities, who's the pilot, not just who's the pilot in command, but what kind of help do you want and what kind of help do you not want. I've had some experiences that taught me how very important that is. The third thing is that, of course, in the airlines, we're all familiar with the passenger briefing. Sometimes it can be more amusing than other times.
Yes, it can.
Sometimes, yeah. But in general aviation, we're also supposed to brief passengers on certain things. And back in 2006 or 7, I sat down and came up with, I like mnemonics because they're easy to remember. We published this in FAA safety briefing, and it's easy to remember because it's safety. It's seat belts, shoulder harnesses, that sort of thing, air vents and cooling. You want to make sure people know how to get air if they need it. The F is for the fire extinguisher. Know where it is, how to unhook it if somebody needs to. The E is several things. It's the exit emergency procedures, what you need them to do. The T is traffic. Tell people you want them to point out traffic, even if it's just over there. And the talking part is you really want your passengers to know when they can and cannot, or when they shouldn't talk to you, like when you're really busy dealing with traffic and the pattern. And then the Y is just for your questions. And I always tell people the only dumb question is the one that you don't ask and get an answer for. So I think that one of the things that we general aviation pilots can bring very helpfully into our standard operating procedures is the briefing for self, the briefing for crew if it's another pilot, and the briefing for passengers, which we often have with us. Excellent.
So let's move on to the next part of the standard operating procedure model, which is checklists and profiles. So the next visual gets into the checklist concept a little bit more. So let's just have a look at that. This part is so essential to how we operate all our flights, whether it's a 121, 135, or general aviation flight. There's a variety of checklists and a variety of mechanisms to accomplish them. There's, of course, the printed checklists that come from the manufacturer. There could be a printed checklist that you've created yourself. There are flows and, of course, mnemonics. And your flight and your standard operating procedures might combine some or all of those. In single pilot operations, I'm a big fan of flows, usually orchestrated by mnemonics. I think we're all familiar with roars and cigars and gumps. I mean, that's just a mnemonic to help you work through a flow, and I'm a big fan of those. If you want to have a printed checklist of those mnemonics that you can check after the fact, I think that's fine. In the 121 world, we teach flows for most of our phases of flight, but of course we have to back it up with a checklist. And the interesting part about this is you do not have to use the manufacturer's checklist word for word. You can start with that and adapt it. And in fact, at our airline, we do not use the manufacturer's checklist. It was the starting point, but our own checklist that's been approved for our operation was sort of a takeoff on the manufacturer's checklist, but adopted to our own operation where we saw some enhancements and improvements. I mean, the manufacturer of an aircraft is just that. They're the manufacturer of the aircraft. They're not the operator. So if you have a manufacturer's checklist that you like using, I think that's great. If you want to adopt it to your own situation and add some things or reorder some things, I think that's great. But think about that. If you get familiar with checklists and you use them as part of your standard operating procedures, keep in mind that SOPs are really there to help you, not when things are going well, but when things are become challenging, so that you have a muscle memory and that you do things the same way, the same time, all the time, when you may have to consider a diversion or perhaps deal with a mechanical problem. So, Susan, I guess you have your own?
I do. Well, first of all, I want to address a couple of things. I have long advocated making my own checklist because I start with a manufacturer's checklist. Obviously, I keep everything on there that needs to be, that they have. But I add things, for example, for the local airspace or for things that I specifically need to remember. And I try to organize them if there's not, unless there's a reason to do things in a certain sequence, I try to organize them in a flow. And I think I've made a checklist for pretty much every airplane that I've flown in, because making the checklist helps me get to know the airplane and think through what makes sense. The other thing, I've had some interesting discussions, I'll call it that, with people about whether it's do and review or review and do or flow. And I don't think that there's a single right answer. I think that sometimes it's very dependent on the function. When you're in the traffic pattern and trying to watch out for traffic, that's not a time to be looking at a printed checklist. But if you're doing pre-flight, particularly on an unfamiliar airplane, then maybe using the checklist as a review and do is better than the other way around. But to me, the key takeaway is that the SOP is to use whatever checklist you find to be useful and comfortable, but to use it in a consistent way.
Absolutely. And one of our viewers has a question about, can we expand a bit on exactly what is a flow, and is it more for a crew or single pilot environment? If I just think about sitting in a 182, just an example of a flow is that if I'm getting ready to start, I just, physically go through mixture, prop, throttle, down to gas, and just those 4 things, and just doing it the same way every time, that represents a flow. You might have a flow about how you shut the aircraft down. So a flow is sort of the physical action of covering certain items on the flight deck that can either be driven by a mnemonic or backed up by a checklist. But and I would say that flows adapt themselves very well to a single pilot operation.
They do.
So that, as you suggested, Susan, you're not sort of managing the checklist while you're managing the buttons. You manage the buttons through a flow and then back it up with a checklist. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Well, actually, I've organized my Flying Club's 182 checklist, which is a printed laminated checklist, but I've organized it so that it is according to a flow, and you can just go across the panel. For example, after landing, you might start down to make sure the cowl flaps are open, and then the wing flaps are retracted, and then just work way across the panel. And then you can look at the checklist and make sure that you've covered everything. But if you just use the flow, you're there, and it's much easier to do. It's less work for you, but it's also efficient and effective.
That's right. It's like GUMPS, gas, undercarriage, mixture, prop, safety. That's actually a mnemonic to help you do a flow. So let's move on to profiles. This is one of my favorite topics.
I was going to say, I know that you talk a lot about profiles and how important they are, and I'm really, it's not something, I think obviously in GA we use checklists, but we don't use profiles as much, and certainly not in the kind of highly structured way that you do. So
let's start with the basics. A profile, I've just taken one out of our flight crew manual just to represent, what's called a takeoff profile. It's basically a graphical representation of various phases of flight with callouts and triggering events. So, for example, this is not an eye test here, but this takeoff profile basically has some callouts referencing, certain speeds and about when we're going to lift off. And there's also callouts about gear retraction, operating the flaps, making sure with the proper speeds. And these profiles are written for takeoff, for climb. We have profiles for non-precision approaches. We have profiles for flying in ILS. We have profiles for even single engine events, since we're in a multi-engine aircraft. And they're just a way to help standardize the way you're going to fly an airplane. And again, they are a starting point. If I can just take an example, if I'm working with a new instrument student, the question may come up when we're doing an ILS, well, when do I lower the gear? Or when do I configure the flaps? The answer doesn't matter too much. The answer really is create a profile that works for you and do it the same way every time, as long as it's consistent with safe operations and air traffic control requirements. Personally, I try to slow down before the final approach fix. I drop the gear when I see glide slope coming in, and I put all of this on a profile so that I know how I'm going to do this. Something simple too about profiles is just power settings. You need to know what power setting achieves what result. If I want to descend at 500 feet a minute, I know how much power reduction I need to do that. So that can be part of a profile, but it's an essential part of standard operating procedures.
Yeah, I can see, headings, altitudes, airspeeds, you might, and waypoints, at least in the sense of, okay, at the final approach fix, which you can think of as a waypoint, that would be where you would do this or that. I know that I didn't learn to call it this, but the way I learned to operate in the traffic pattern is really a profile, because you have this speed on downwind, and then you put flaps down, and then base and final and that sort of thing. I think another point about profiles that, when we kick this around a little bit, is that the profile, flying by numbers, painting by numbers, flying by numbers, it's the best way to get a consistent result. But you also do have to, it's a starting point that you adjust as necessary.
Absolutely.
Because if somebody else is ahead of you in the pattern and taking more time, then you're going to need to do something a little bit different than to adjust for that. But you have to start someplace, and having a profile, which you've encouraged me to make, by the way. I'm going to have to do that for more phases of flight.
Well, it's just a way of helping to standardize what you do. And again, you're right. It is a starting point. It's just like the manufacturer's checklist. It's a starting point, but you may make some enhancements. Every airplane has different requirements, but there's nothing to stop you from graphing out how you want to manage this and do it consistently. And in a way, it'll make things a lot easier for you.
Well, that's it's a good practice. So let's go on to the next part.
So the next part of this is situational awareness, and it's about review. That was the next part in our continuum of standard operating procedures, is review, and it deals with call outs and cross checks. So let's have a look at the call outs first. Whether you're in a single pilot environment or a two-person environment, you can make call outs. Just a simple thing that I do, if I'm single pilot and I'm at 4,000 climbing to 5,000, I will say to myself, 1,000 feet to go. We do the same thing in the airline environment. It's a trigger to be aware that something is going to be happening soon. And you can develop a set of call outs for various phases of flight and various operations, repeating frequencies to yourself. Air traffic control gives you a clearance to a waypoint. You can call that out yourself while you're programming it, just to make sure.
Yeah, I do that. That's another part of the keeping me, myself, and I, when I'm the crew, to keep myself ready to go. And I also try to do call outs for things like waypoints, because I find that with GPS and moving maps, sometimes you can get lazy because you think you can glance at the map at any given time. And if you do a call out when you're crossing a waypoint, like crossing Wito, next fix is whatever it is, then you actually have helped embed in your head where you are in terms of situational awareness. So that's certainly something that I like to use.
Yeah, if you're in a two-person environment, you can agree on what the call outs can be. But again, a single pilot, I do the same thing. It helps bring it to consciousness and helps prevent mistakes. And cross-check is the next part of this. So our next part of situational awareness is cross-check, which is another way of saying verify. I'm of an age, I'm not sure about you, Susan, but I'm of an age where I remember President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev and Reagan's phrase, which is trust but verify. Yeah. And I think that's exactly what we do in aviation. We trust, but we have to verify both air traffic control clearances, but also just what we do ourselves. I know you have a story to tell, but I had an event sitting on the flight deck of our airline one time where I was plugging in the waypoints of a flight. And when I was all done, I realized that we were going to land with no fuel. And I thought, well, either we haven't got fuel on the airplane or there's some other problem. Well, we had fuel on the airplane, but the intersection that I had programmed was about 900 miles off course. and it was there were two intersections in the National Airspace System. Both are pronounced BB, B-E-B-E-E, and B-E-B-B-E, and I put one in instead of the other. But the message here is a lot of those type of mistakes, they happen before you move the airplane, which means they are preventable.
Yeah, I had one like that too years ago, headed to Sun and Fun, and they were making a fuel stop in Augusta, Georgia. And we started to approach, and I think I was with another pilot, and we were both fairly new to the GPS at that point. And we realized that the GPS was about to command us to make a 180-degree turn and fly several hundred miles in the opposite direction. And it turns out that the identifier for Augusta, Georgia is AGS, and the one for Augusta, Maine is the one we had in there. So we went to the controller and explained that we really didn't want to turn around to go to Maine today, thank you. But it was a learning experience, because if we had cross-checked our flight plan a little more carefully before we launched, we would have, just like you said, we would have found it before we left the ground. But
sure.
Cross-checking everything, headings, altitudes. Another thing that I do for cross-checking, this call out and cross-check, when somebody's programming the autopilot or making a change to it, I ask for call outs. Tell me which modes are engaged, which ones are armed, and who's flying the airplane. Is it the flight director or the autopilot? If the flight director is on and the autopilot is not, the flight director is providing the brain, but you're providing the muscle. And it's really important to know who's in charge.
Absolutely. We have one other question from a viewer. Could we recommend where this individual could go to create profiles for different phases of flight as a starting point? And I would say yes, send me an email. My email address will be at the end of this presentation, and we can set up and chat a bit. So feel free to do that. The last part of our standard operating procedures is renew. And renew is really about training. And as a training person, this is near and dear to my heart, because I've been involved in it for so long. Recurrent training, of course, is key. And there are so many opportunities for training. I mean, we all have to do our flight review, our instrument proficiency check. I mean, those are to meet legal requirements, but I'm a fan of monthly training. And it doesn't mean you have to meet with an instructor, but I think that's a good idea from time to time, just to meet with an instructor outside of a normal training cycle. AOPA, Air Safety Foundation, has some wonderful courses. The FAA has some courses. The NAFI Professional Development Committee is getting ready to launch some courses for training. There's apps. If you just stay involved on a regular basis and have a personal study program, part of your standard operating procedures, then it helps keep your head in the game, and it's fun. It's fun to learn new things. So,
yeah,
Susan,
that's certainly what
I know
I
you're
do.
a supporter of the Wings program.
Absolutely. In fact, I just finished a Wings phase over this weekend. I'm always pushing my flight review date out by a few months when I complete a Wings phase. I try to do that. I read a lot. I kind of am of the opinion that even if my feet have to be on the ground, my head can still be in the sky with reading about techniques and procedures. I get a lot of publications. And of course, I have to put in a plug for FA Safety Briefing. We all are operating one way or another in the airspace, and we try really hard to address topics that are useful to the GA community. So the things that I write for it, and I hope are going to be useful to people who are reading it, are also part of continuing education. So there are all sorts of things formally and informally that you can do, but there's nothing better to do than just to realize that we all need to keep our skills sharp and current. And it takes a little bit of effort to do that, but it is fun. It's a reason to go fly.
And as we said, there's joining up with an instructor that you like working with outside of a normal training cycle or legal structure is a great way to go out and just try something that maybe you haven't done in a while. So I'm a big supporter of that, of course. I mean, in the airlines, we have some pretty rigid training requirements, but it's all to make sure that our pilots stay safe and proficient.
So we've been through the model now. Let's take another last look at it before we wrap up tonight.
So if everyone remembers, we started with this slide about standard operating procedures, and I was in the center of the picture on that one in my 121 world. And on purpose, we've put you in this, Susan, to basically show the connection between 121 and general aviation. If we both do the same thing and develop a set of standard operating procedures, then although the GA world, in our opinion, is more challenging, it can be made less so by adopting a set of standard operating procedures and doing the same thing each time, every time. So that's our sort of conclusion on this, is there's room for both things in using standard operating procedures.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about how you can use it in all phases of flight, and you've talked about things like muscle memory. It actually, once you've made the investment in planning, that it lowers your workload and it leaves you with a lot more bandwidth to deal with, because if you know how the standard way to do something is and you don't have to think about that all the time, you have more brain space and bandwidth, as they call it, to deal with things that might be a change, that might require a change or something different. So there are a lot of good things to be had here.
And before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to make a comment about professionalism. In my opinion, getting paid is only one part of being a professional pilot. You do not have to get paid to be a professional pilot. I know many general aviation pilots that I consider are the ultimate in professionalism by the way they manage their flight and the way they conduct themselves. The pay part is not really part of the equation. It's a bit of a byproduct of it, but I would contend that all pilots who adopt these procedures and who operate in the complicated systems that we operate in, we're all professional pilots. Absolutely,
and that's what we all want to be. So there are a lot of things that we talked about here tonight that, I think we are covered in more depth in some of the articles. So one of the things that we've added for this time, you'll see along with the wings credit tab and the course eval tab, I'll show that in a second, but we've got a learn more section. And that Learn More tab has links to some articles that we think are related to what we've talked about tonight. So if we go to the next slide, I think we've got a list of a few of them.
Sure.
On the right-hand side there, you'll see the articles from AOPA Flight Training Magazine and EAA Sport Pilot, the current issue specifically about SOPs. And then FA Safety Briefing has done quite a few articles that are relevant to the specific topics we've been through tonight. And the next slide shows you a list of those. You'll find links to them in the Learn More tab. You don't need to memorize them all here. And I'll tell you right now, you don't need to have read all these articles to take the quiz, but these are just, this is part of your renew and recurrent training and keeping going, things that you can learn and hopefully profit from.
Well, it's been fun. This wraps up the May edition of Mentor Live from the National Association of Flight Instructors. We appreciate your attention and participation. And Susan, it's been nice to work with you.
Absolutely. It's been fun, and learned some good things. I think I'm going to have to talk to you about developing GA profiles myself.
Let's do that.
So thank you to everybody, and good night.
And stay safe.